For nearly 3 years, one simple question about the best preserved Ice Age puppy ever discovered refused to get a simple answer. Was it a dog or was it a wolf? Under normal circumstances, that question barely takes an afternoon to settle. Dog and wolf. DNA is different enough that modern genetic testing separates the two species almost instantly, the same way a lab can tell a house cat from a bobcat without a second thought. In this one case, it wasn't that simple. Every round of testing came back the same way, unresolved. In 2022, scientists analyzing the largest ancient wolf genome dataset ever assembled finally answered the question. The answer wasn't really about this one puppy at all. It was about something far bigger hiding inside his DNA the whole time, a discovery that ended up rewriting part of the story of how dogs came to exist in the first place. In the summer of 2018, mammoth tusk hunters searching the thawing Permafrost near the Indigirka River in the Sakha Republic in eastern Siberia uncovered a frozen lump of ground containing the body of a puppy. The region has produced an increasing number of these discoveries in recent years, as warming temperatures thaw ground that had stayed frozen solid for tens of thousands of years, while rising demand for mammoth ivory, used as a legal substitute for elephant ivory in parts of Asia, has sent more people out searching that same thawing ground for tusks. The puppy was handed over to Sergei Fyodorov, a researcher at the Northeastern Federal University in Yakutsk, who carefully cleaned away the surrounding dirt and found something almost unbelievable underneath: fully intact fur. Once fully examined, the specimen showed intact whiskers, eyelashes, a visible black nose, pink gums, and a full set of baby teeth, evidence the animal was still nursing when it died. Bone growth indicated it was male and had died at around 2 months old, though the cause of death was never determined. The remains were kept at the private Northern World Museum in Yakutsk, under the care of director Nikolai Androsov, while researchers around the world worked to figure out exactly what they were looking at. A sample from one of its ribs was sent to Love Dalen, a professor of evolutionary genetics at the Center for Paleogenetics in Stockholm, for radiocarbon dating. The result placed the puppy's age at roughly 18,000 years old, meaning it had been sitting frozen in that riverbank since long before the last ice age had even finished retreating. Researchers named it Dogor, the word for friend in the local Yakut language, a name that also happened to sound exactly like the question everyone actually wanted answered: dog or wolf. If you are finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. That question turned out to be far harder than anyone expected. Dalen's team ran DNA testing, expecting a routine result. Modern dog and wolf genomes carry clear, well-documented differences, distinctions genetic labs check for a living or recently deceased animal without much difficulty, since thousands of years of separate breeding and separate evolutionary pressure have left dogs and wolves with genomes that diverge in specific identifiable places. Dogor's DNA didn't sort cleanly into either category. The stakes made the ambiguity even more tantalizing. A separate, similarly well-preserved puppy had already been found in the same general region back in 2016, in the village of Tumat, dated to roughly 12,400 years old and confirmed as a genuine dog. If Dogor turned out to be a dog as well, at 18,000 years old, he would instantly become the oldest confirmed dog ever discovered anywhere on Earth, pushing back the accepted timeline of domestication by thousands of years, and potentially settling one of the most contested questions in the field. By the time the discovery was formally presented to the public in December of 2019, researchers had already run through multiple rounds of testing without a conclusive answer and were preparing a third round in hopes of finally placing Dogor somewhere on the canine family tree. Dalen said publicly that a result this ambiguous would be almost unheard of in a modern specimen, and that Dogor came from exactly the kind of time period likely to matter most for understanding when and how dogs first split away from wolves. Other researchers involved in the early analysis floated a third possibility beyond a simple dog or wolf label. that Dogor could represent an animal from right around the actual moment of domestication, early enough that the genetic split between the two lineages hadn't finished happening yet. A creature caught mid-transition rather than belonging cleanly to either side. The uncertainty itself became the story, and Dogor was framed in headlines around the world as a possible missing link, a creature that could represent the exact evolutionary moment when wolves first began turning into dogs. Getting a real answer required something far larger than one puppy's genome could provide on its own. Comparing Dogor against a small handful of modern dog and wolf genomes, the only kind of comparison available in 2019, simply didn't have enough historical context built in to place an 18,000-year-old specimen correctly. What the case actually needed was a much deeper, much wider dataset, stretching back across the entire span of time wolves and early dogs had existed side by side, something no single research group studying one puppy could have assembled on its own. In 2022, a massive international research effort led by geneticists Anders Bergström and Pontus Skoglund, and involving dozens of collaborating scientists across institutions in Europe, North America, and Russia, including Dallin himself, published a study in the journal Nature that dwarfed anything attempted on this question before. The team sequenced 72 ancient wolf genomes spanning the last 100,000 years, recovered from sites across Europe, Siberia, and North America. It was, by a wide margin, the most complete genetic timeline of wolf evolution ever assembled, built from remains excavated across 3 continents and multiple decades of fieldwork, pulling together fossil material that had been sitting in separate museum collections and research freezers on different continents, much of it never previously compared against each other in a single unified analysis. Dogor's genome was folded directly into it as one specimen among many rather than examined in isolation, the way it had been in 2019. What that larger dataset revealed changed the entire context around why Dogor's DNA had looked so confusing in the first place. Ancient wolf populations across the last ice age turned out to be far more genetically connected to one another than wolf populations are today, with levels of genetic separation between different regional groups roughly 10 times lower than what separates wolf populations now. Modern wolves in different parts of the world carry distinct, well-separated genetic signatures built up over thousands of years of relative isolation, shaped by geography, hunting pressure, and human expansion steadily cutting populations off from one another and confining them to smaller and smaller ranges. 18,000 years ago, that separation barely existed yet. Wolves could travel enormous distances across an open, largely unbroken landscape spanning much of the northern hemisphere, moving and interbreeding across territory that modern political borders, highways, and cities would make impossible for a wild wolf population to cross today, and individual wolves across huge stretches of the ancient world were far more genetically similar to each other than modern wolves are. That meant a single ambiguous-looking genome, examined without that context, could easily look like it belonged somewhere between categories that hadn't yet fully split apart. Dogor's DNA was never confused. Scientists simply hadn't yet built the map needed to place it correctly, and no single specimen, however well preserved, could have supplied that map on its own. With that map in hand, Bergström directly identified Dogor as an ancient wolf, closing the 3-year question of what species he actually belonged to. He was not a dog, and he was not the missing link the 2019 headlines had hoped for. But that answer came with an immediate complication, one significant enough that it kept Dogor relevant to the science of dog domestication even after his own species had finally been settled. Dogor's specific genetic lineage did not belong to the eastern wolf population that research increasingly points to as the direct ancestral source of modern dogs. He was a wolf, definitively, just not the kind of wolf anyone had been looking for when they wondered whether he might be an ancestor to every dog alive today. He was a close relative of that ancestral population, alive at nearly the right place and nearly the right time, without actually being part of the specific lineage domestication traces back to. Close enough genetically to have caused 3 years of confusion, but distinct enough to ultimately be ruled out as the direct ancestor everyone had hoped he was. Reaching that conclusion took the combined effort of researchers across dozens of institutions, comparing specimens recovered from archaeological digs on 3 separate continents, work that had never been assembled into one single, directly comparable timeline before this study brought it all together. Dogor was just one of 72 individual wolves in that dataset, but he was the one whose earlier ambiguity had already made headlines, which meant his specific placement carried more public weight than almost any other single genome in the entire collection. And reporters who had covered the original 2019 mystery picked the story back up the moment the 2022 paper was published. Subscribe to not miss the next one. That complication turned out to be the real discovery, and it went far beyond settling the identity of one frozen puppy. Placing dogs into the same genetic timeline built from all 72 wolf genomes, the research team found that domestic dogs do not trace back to a single ancestral wolf population at all. Dogs carry ancestry from at least 2 separate ancient wolf populations, an eastern source that contributed genetic material to every dog alive today, no matter the breed or location, and a second, more westerly population that contributed additional ancestry to some dog lineages, but not others. For a species long assumed to have a single clean domestication story, one moment, one population, one place, this was a direct contradiction of that simpler picture. Dogs did not descend from one ancient wolf lineage. They carried the genetic legacy of at least 2, blended together at some point in the deep past in a way researchers are still working to fully untangle, meaning the true origin story of the dog sitting in someone's living room today is more tangled than a single domestication event thousands of years ago in one place. The same dataset that overturned dog ancestry also revealed the kind of detail only possible with a genetic record spanning 100,000 years. Researchers tracked a specific mutation in a gene called IFT88, linked to skull and facial development, sweeping rapidly through wolf populations sometime between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago. A mutation sweeping through a population means it spread from a small handful of individuals to become common across the entire species in a relatively short window, the genetic signature of a trait so useful that animals carrying it consistently outsurvived and out-reproduced animals that didn't. Catching that kind of event requires comparing genomes across a long, continuous timeline, rather than a handful of scattered samples, since a single ancient genome only offers a snapshot, while dozens of genomes spaced across tens of thousands of years can show the moment a trait actually took hold and spread. A level of natural selection in action like this, a single genome, or even a handful of genomes, could never have exposed on its own. Only a dataset this large, spanning this much time, could catch evolution changing an entire species in real time, rather than showing a single frozen snapshot of it. The exact ancestral wolf population that gave rise to dogs, the one specific group among all 72 genomes analyzed, and the countless others that existed but were never preserved or never found, still hasn't been pinpointed. Researchers are continuing to search additional regions, particularly further south, hoping to eventually identify a genome close enough to serve as the direct ancestral source rather than a distant relative of it, the way Dogor turned out to be. Domestication itself, the actual moment wolves began the long transformation into dogs, remains an open question sitting inside a puzzle this 18,000-year-old puppy helped assemble but did not personally solve. That gap matters beyond scientific curiosity. Pinning down exactly where and when dogs first split from wolves would settle a debate that has run through archaeology and genetics for decades, one involving competing proposals ranging from a single domestication event in East Asia to multiple independent domestication events happening in different regions at different times. The 72 genome study didn't end that debate. It gave researchers a far more detailed map to keep working from and ruled out the simplest possible answer in the process. What remains true about Dogor after all of this is straightforward. He was a 2-month-old male wolf pup who died roughly 18,000 years ago near a Siberian river, so well preserved by permafrost that his whiskers and eyelashes survived intact into the 21st century. He was never a hybrid, and never the missing link between wolves and dogs that early headlines hoped he might be. And he never became the oldest dog ever found the way the two-month puppy comparison once suggested he might. What his DNA actually revealed, once scientists finally had the tools and the dataset large enough to read it correctly, was something neither Dalen's original team nor anyone else studying him in 2019 had any way of predicting. Dogs themselves carry a more complicated two-part ancestry than researchers had assumed for decades, built from at least two ancient wolf populations rather than one. Dogor didn't turn out to be the missing link anyone was searching for. He turned out to be proof that the story of how wolves became dogs was more complicated than the simple single-origin version science had been telling for years. A puppy that spent 18,000 years frozen in Siberian ground, waiting for a dataset large enough to finally read what his DNA had been saying the entire time.